Well, hey, man, church family, Pastor Joe here. Hey, listen, I'm coming at you with some bonus content for our Pastor's Guide to the End Times series. Pretty much every week when I write a message, I end up having to cut material out that I put in originally just for the sake of time. Doesn't all fit. So there's almost always content that you don't get to hear on a Sunday. In this series, I'm going to try to give you some of that content, at least for right now. In fact, after week number 1 of the sermon series, an individual in the church came up to me and they asked me a specific question about a prophecy that they had heard about. They asked about what they called the red heifer prophecy and how it relates to all these other things. And I'll just be completely honest. In that moment, I was thinking, a red heifer, what? Like, what is this prophecy? Because I haven't heard that prophecy. And like in that moment, my mind is going through, I've read the Bible many times, cover to cover. Like I've studied eschatology in college. And so I'm sitting here going, red heifer, like what is that? And I could not think of a prophecy in the Bible that talked about a red heifer and its association with the end times. And so we had this kind of conversation. I said, well, I got to look into that. And so that next week, I spent some time researching what is the red heifer prophecy. And turns out it is all over the internet. A lot of people have been talking about it. I thought, man, I must have missed something. I went back to the Bible. I was really encouraged because there is no prophecy about a red heifer in the Bible anywhere, not even unrelated to end times. There is no such thing as a red heifer prophecy. So you're saying, Joe, okay, but everybody is talking about it. Not everybody. A lot of people are talking about it. What is going on here? Well, it actually relates to a whole nother thing. The significance isn't in the red heifer. It's what the Orthodox Jews believe to be important about the red heifer so that they can build the temple of God in Jerusalem, a third temple in Jerusalem. There's one passage of scripture found in Numbers chapter 19, which describes the sacrifice of a red heifer. If you're not familiar with like an agricultural background or something like that, a heifer is very simply a young female cow who has not given birth to a calf yet. And so a red-haired female cow. That's what this is about. And so they would sacrifice in Numbers chapter 19 the red heifer, and they would use the ashes of that heifer in purification rites for Old Testament ceremonial law. And so they would cleanse people through the ashes mixed with water of a red heifer, and the priest would dip his finger in that even for the dedication of the temple. So there is a movement going on right now in Israel and in Jerusalem where Orthodox Jews, and I'm not a Jewish scholar, I don't fully understand all of the new laws of Judaism and the different ways they approach that. What I understand is there are 4 branches of Judaism right now. Conservative and Orthodox Jews are really kind of together in this movement of rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. And for them, they believe that in order to do that, and in order to have these rites, these ceremonial rites again, they need to have an unblemished red heifer that they can sacrifice and use the ashes in these purification rites again. So the red heifers, which apparently 5 were shipped to Israel in 2022. They are there now. They're waiting upon this moment of sacrifice. And so they believe that when they have those, then they can start rebuilding the temple. Now this could be pretty controversial because the temple of God originally, right now in that original location, the Dome of the Rock is located. And so for the Jews to rebuild the temple, it might require the demolition of the Dome of the Rock. You can imagine how inflammatory that would be for that region and for Muslims all around the world. It is a holy site for them that's been there for a very long time. This would be a significant deal. I've heard other people say, hey, the most holy place may actually be located adjacent to the site of the Dome of the Rock. So there's actually the potential that they could build a temple in Jerusalem next to the Dome of the Rock, and the two could be there at the same time. Either way, they want to sacrifice the red heifer before they build a temple, which they already have plans for. You say, Joe, what in the world does that have to do with end times? Why are people talking about this? Well, there's no end times prophecy about a red heifer. There are, however, references to a temple being in existence at the end. We see it in Matthew chapter 24, potentially. It says in verse 15, we studied this chapter this past week. It says in verse 15, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down and take what is in the house, etc., etc., etc. And so there's two things that, quite frankly, there's a lot of debate on. What is the abomination of desolation? And what is Jesus referring to as the holy place? And one of the positions that is argued is the abomination of desolation is a reference to the Antichrist, not an Antichrist, but the Antichrist that's to come at the end. And the holy place would be the temple of God. Just know that there's disagreement about that, of what each of those things represent. Then in 2 Thessalonians, might be the most clear one. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, listen to this. This is the Apostle Paul really writing this letter to the church in Thessalonica. He says this in verse 1. Now concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered together to him, we ask you, brothers, not to be quickly shaken in mind or alarmed, either by a spirit or a spoken word or a letter seeming to be from us to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. In other words, there were some believers in the church in Thessalonica that were really afraid that Jesus had come and that they missed it. Sound familiar? Like they felt like, oh no, this has happened. We missed it. They were all like sensationalism to the max of what might have taken place. And Paul says this, verse 3, let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. And so some people see this and saying, okay, this is a clear reference to the Antichrist, the one that's to come at the end times, and he is going to set himself up in the temple of God, and they would take that to mean a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. Now again, you need to understand, some people believe this has already happened. This actually took place around AD 70 and the overthrowing of the temple and the destruction of the temple in the Jewish War of 67 to 70 AD. Some people believe this prophecy in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 was already fulfilled. Other people believe that when Paul refers to the temple of God, he's not referring to a literal temple. Not the temple that the Jews would have, but just like Paul has in other places, referring to perhaps the church or the place where people would gather in worship, like a definitive moment that the Antichrist might appear to and set itself up against God. Because Paul describes the temple of God not as a location, but as his people, as the church. So there's different views on this. But one of those views is that there will be a literal temple in Jerusalem at the end times. Revelation chapter 11. Again, multiple views on that. But it could be that there is a literal temple in Jerusalem. So when people look at this and they say, wait a second, there are plans being made to build a temple in Jerusalem. That would potentially launch war between Israel and other nations. Like that would potentially set the stage, and now we have some of the things needed for some of the fulfillment of these prophecies at the end times. Maybe this is a sign that we're getting closer. Saying, Joe, like, is it or isn't it? And the answer is, I don't know. It could be, but it might not. There's so many different ways to look at this. Here's what it means for me. I'm just going to be watching it. And if a third temple is rebuilt in Jerusalem, I'm not worried about the red heifer in terms of end time prophecy. Like, that's irrelevant. You don't need that. It's only relevant for the Orthodox Jews rebuilding the temple and instituting perhaps Old Testament ceremonial law and sacrifice again. But for us as Christians, there's references to a temple. If those are literal references, then I'm going to be paying attention if a third temple is built. But then again, in these passages, it doesn't say third temple. It says temple. So who's to say it's not the fourth temple or the fifth temple? You see how clear this gets? Like, we don't actually know. Should we pay attention? Yeah, I think we should. Is it definitive? It just isn't. And so we just need to have this wisdom as we approach this. At the end of the day, this is not something to be afraid of. As I've said time and again, I'm going to preach a whole message on this. The end times and the fulfillment of prophecy leading us to the end times is not something to stir up fear. It's actually a moment of hope. It's a moment of joy. It's a moment of excitement. Will it be easy? No, it's not going to be easy. Will there be challenges and tribulation and difficulty? Yeah, there will be some difficult things that Christians face. But we serve a God who is sovereign and in control and working through it all. We know how the end is going to be. Jesus wins. So let's do what I mentioned at the end of last message. Let's be people who live God-honoring lives. And let's be people who live for the mission of God to bring the good news of Jesus to the ends of the earth. That's how we be the people that are prepared whenever Jesus returns. So let's not just look for things and say, okay, when those things happen, then I'll get ready. No. That defeats the purpose of what Jesus calls us to. We are called to be ready in season and out of season, to stay awake, to be prepared. We don't know when he's coming back. We should live each and every day intentionally and purposely for the sake of his kingdom, knowing he could come back, but he might not. I hope that helps. If you have more questions, feel free to email us, cos@manna.church. May be able to respond to them. God bless you guys.